A university did a study on building a solar power system like this to determine whether or not it makes sense to defect from the grid from a financial standpoint, from a pure return on investment standpoint. And out of 18 locations, only 4 beat the grid. We're going to get into those numbers today. Now, if you've been following the channel, you know that I did not build this rather expensive solar power system for an ROI. I built it as a redundant source of power, backup energy, in case of a prolonged grid down situation. We're talking more than a couple of days, weeks, months, or even years. That's why we built this. So my ROI is long, as you'll see if you watch some of my other videos. But I know that many of you are really focused on ROI, so this video is for you. Let's get into the numbers of this research paper. Solar panels produce the lowest cost electricity in history, and battery prices continue to fall. Meanwhile, the utilities are making it more difficult for you to make any kind of reasonable amount of income by selling back your power to the grid in a net metering type of arrangement. So I think the utility companies are a little bit concerned that there might be a chance that people would start defecting from the grid and find that it would be much cheaper to be on solar than on the grid. That could cause more and more people to drop off the grid, causing the utility companies to continue to raise rates, which would create something called a death spiral, where the utilities would eventually just go out of business because their rates would have to be too high to continue to supply an increasingly smaller and smaller audience of people willing to pay for it. That's the essence of this paper created by 2 guys, Sadat and Pearce, in 2024, called Solar Energy. I'll link it below if you really want to dive into the details, but I'm going to give you the essence and show you the charts and explain the whole thing right here on this video today. These researchers asked the obvious question, and that is solar energy cheap enough today that a large amount of people could defect from the grid, just go completely off grid using solar as their primary source of electricity and not send the utility company a dime? Obviously, the stakeholders in huge energy conglomerates are mortified by this concept, but it needed to be proved out. So in this study, they looked at 18 different locations around the country. Here's a map. You can see that the amount of solar across these regions varies greatly, which ultimately gives a more clear picture of what, on a national scale, defecting from the grid could entail. The researchers looked at 18 locations across 13 states in the US and determined that yes, so far today, 4 of those locations would be cheaper and it would be more beneficial to those customers to leave the utility than it would be to stay and continue to pay those high rates over a lifetime. Chart number 2 is the master table and is pretty much the whole research paper in one shot. Every row is a city and divided into 3 buckets. Grid defection, meaning it's time to leave because it's cheaper if you have your own solar power. Marginal, meaning it's kind of on the fence, you could go either way. And then stay on the grid means it's very obvious staying on the grid is a lot less expensive than trying to buy your own solar system. 4 cities landed into the leave bucket, and that's Honolulu, Kauai, San Diego, and San Francisco. Those cities, it makes more sense to just defect and get off the grid. Each city has a different size system. Now, why would they do that? Well, this was all done in an algorithm. So if they used one system across all 18 areas, it wouldn't make any sense. There's no way to get a side-by-side comparison because the weather is so drastically different. All throughout the paper, they call an inverter a converter. It's just the software vocabulary. They mean inverter. And you can see behind me that I've got 2 sol-ark 15K inverters. So I'm producing 30 kilowatts of inverter capacity, which is much more than any of the individual cities that were studied. I just want to point out that there are so many variables to what system you could build versus what they used in this paper. But I think what they were doing was just trying to show that based on weather and having to occasionally use a diesel generator, that they needed to make basically the smallest system they can make, augmented by a generator, which is often what you're doing. You try and keep costs down because you don't want to buy all this extra capacity like I did to be able to bridge across cloudy weather days. You can't defect and go off grid if you don't have power during certain times of year. That's where the generator comes in. Smaller system augmented by a generator, which you run as often as you need. And remember that the cost of fuel also is a variable in this study, and that changes over time. You have to keep that in mind, that there are some certain things that would change over a lifespan of a solar system, including the diesel fuel cost. Also should point out that where I am, we have a well pump, which draws a significant amount of power. We also have 2 3-ton air conditioners. We've got welders, and we have all sorts of things that aren't considered part of a normal household energy load. So that's another reason why my particular system that you see in the background here really has little to do with how they conducted this study. This chart is how you read payback, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The black line is your running total. That starts deep underwater, that big red bar at year 0, which is the check you wrote when you built your system. Every year, the blue bars up top push you back towards the surface. Those are avoided costs, the power bills that you never paid. Now watch the black line climb. The moment it crosses the 0 axis, the system has paid for itself. Everything after that is profit. San Diego crosses that bar at year 6, so 6 years to break even and then 19 years of free power. See those blue spikes? Those are battery replacements. The model is honest about the fact that batteries do not last 25 years, and the system pays for itself anyway. Chart number 4 is asking why these 4 cities are inviting people to defect from the grid. Every bar is what the grid charges per kilowatt hour in each city. The green shaded zones start at 25 cents, and the researchers draw the line right there. If you're paying 25 cents or more per kilowatt hour, you are in what they call the high cost zone, and grid defection starts to become worth a serious look. San Diego is way out into the deep green, 69 cents, and the 4 winners are all in the green. Most of the country is not even close. In fact, the national average sits back here around 16 cents. Here in my part of southern Utah, we're somewhere, and it changes throughout the year, but the rates are generally between 9 and 11 cents per kilowatt hour. So it would have made a lot more financial sense for me just to continue with a grid connection, because we were close enough to the wire that the trenching cost didn't break the bank. So when we first built this house, we trenched across and we were running on grid power for the first few years until we could afford to buy this system you see behind me and build this barn that this system is connected to, and the big solar array that sits right outside this door. Chart 5 shows something that you've got to remember, that in 2024 we still had the tax credit. When I built this system, I was able to utilize that 30% tax credit offset, which saved me a lot of money at the end of the year that I was able to then sort of credit back to the original cost, if that makes sense. That tax credit has now disappeared. So keep that in mind as you look at this chart. There are 3 bars per city. The tan bar is what grid power costs there, that city, and the gray bar is what off-grid power costs without any federal credit. The green bar is off-grid with the 30% tax credit that the study assumed. Section 25D of the tax code expired January 1st in 2026. No phase down, just gone. So that green bar in this chart is a moot point. But look closely at the 4 winning cities. Compare the gray bar, no incentives at all, against the tan grid bar. The gray bar is still lower. So in all 4 cities, off-grid power was cheaper than the grid before the government kicked in a dime. The credit did not create the win, it just made the win come faster. Kill the tax credit and the payback period stretches. So 6 years becomes longer, 14 even longer, but the basic fundamentals survive, and whether or not it pays to go off grid still remains on all 4 cities. And that is an affirmative. It pays without the credit in all 4 cities to go off grid. Hey guys, real quick, I'm not going to ask you to subscribe right now because I don't do that. Well, actually I do usually do that. But if you would just give this a thumbs up, that tells the algorithm that this is useful content, and it will show it to other people. This study that's important to anyone that's trying to determine if it makes sense to buy solar for their property. So that's all I'm asking. It's free, just click it if you don't mind, and let's get back to the video. You know, I get asked all the time, does it pencil out to go off grid? You know, battery cost, inverter cost, labor, like who's doing the labor? Are you gonna hire a professional electrician, or do you need to trench? Are you gonna do ground mount or roof mount? There's so many different factors, but I think this chart kind of gets into some specifics that might make sense to you. It's called a sensitivity analysis. The research grabbed each input one at a time and cranked it from its lowest plausible value to its highest to see which one swings the final cost the most. The longer the bar, the more that factor matters. Look at the longest bar on the whole chart. It's not the solar equipment, it is inflation, and it's attached to the cost of staying on the grid. Think about what that means. When you buy a solar power system, you're locking in that cost right on day one. Steel on the ground, price locked. When you're buying grid power, you're basically paying for a subscription that will continue to go up and to the right over the entire time that you live in that house. That's inflationary trends, right? They're going up and to the right. So if you believe that inflation is going to continue to rise, then you are staving off and hedging against that with a solar power system that you buy today. And the researchers say this definitively in the study. You're not just buying power, you're buying certainty over a 25-year period of time. And that has a lot of value to a lot of people. I personally consider that a financial instrument that I have bolted to my pasture. Which brings me to something I found on my sol-ark app this week. If you're not familiar, these inverters behind me have a little dongle. It transmits what's going on in real time on my solar power plant to an app that I can see on my computer or on my phone. And I went in there and there's a little tab that says Utility Connect Options. And I logged in there and it says no VPP available. So what is a VPP? That is a virtual power plant. And essentially that's the same thing as net metering. It's when your batteries get full, like mine do every day about noon, and then all of the production of this whole system goes into float, or it just can no longer hold any more electricity. And even though we're using power in the house and the batteries are fully charged, there's a little bit trickling through the system that's powering our current needs at that time. But the bulk of the solar that we're utilizing from the array is going nowhere because it's way more than we're using inside and the batteries are already full. So where does all that power from noon or 1 o'clock until when the sun goes down, where's all that going? Well, it's going nowhere because I can't sell it back. Well, actually, technically I could sell it back to Rocky Mountain Power, but instead of them giving me a check and buying that back at the full rate, they only give me 3 to 4 cents depending on the time of year, and they offer it as only a credit to offset my usage. But guess what? I've got the disconnect switch flipped to off, so I'm not using the grid. And even if I turn that on to utilize that VPP option, it's not enough because I don't use enough power for it to offset anything. And at the end of the year, it expires and those credits just go away. So they don't send me a check. Now, when I was in Southern California and I had a different setup through Tesla and my system was connected to the grid there at Southern California Edison, they would actually credit me back for all the power that I used and send me a check for anything above and beyond what I used. And that was a pretty cool setup. So everybody has a different VPP or a different net metering. So you have to contact your utility to find out what's involved. It will usually have a separate meter that will run backwards. So it's allowing energy to feed back from your system when you're not using it, feeds it back onto the line, and it runs backwards and you get credit for that. You also have to have an inverter that can have all these different options. So off-grid completely, or grid tied, or a VPP or net metering option. These sol-ark inverters do have that option, but I'm not utilizing it. Again, you would have to have that built into your system and a special meter, and it's not something that you would have at all if you're completely off-grid. So if you're a off-grid purist, you have no grid connection because it's too expensive or because you don't want it or you're too far away from the lines, this whole section doesn't mean anything to you. You can skip this. But for everyone else who is considering net metering potentially or selling your power back, you would need to have those two things: inverters that can handle that task and a special meter from your utility. And you have to sign some sort of an agreement with your utility company, of course, and it's for the safety of the linemen as well, that would automatically shut down if they're working on the line so they don't get electrocuted. In a supposedly de-energized condition, you wouldn't want them to get electrocuted because your system was feeding back. Anyway, all that would be taken care of if you properly execute a net metering agreement or a VPP. So here's my interpretation of this entire paper. You ready? Okay. If you're sitting in a high utility rate, high sun market with a rate of 25 cents or more, and you have real sunshine, the peer-reviewed math says cutting the cord is defensible on money alone, even without the tax credit. Now, if you're not in one of those areas, meaning you don't have really abundant sun and you're paying less than 25 cents per kilowatt hour, then this is probably not a financial play for you. What it is a resilience play. Keeping the lights on no matter what's going on with the grid. Keeping your water flowing if you have a well system, keeping your water flowing even when the grid is down. And for me, that's the case here. Financially, it doesn't make any sense for me to have spent the amount of money that I did on this system. I did it because I want continuity of power regardless of the weather, regardless of the shenanigans that the utility companies or the governments may play, regardless of whether or not the grid is down or up. I can keep my water running, I can keep my household going, And quite frankly, I'll hardly even notice for the first several days until I start reading the news reports that something serious is going on. I will be completely immune to it. In fact, the power goes out here quite often and I don't even notice. I'll get a notification on my phone because I'm still on the Rocky Mountain Power app. It says, we're sorry to inform you that service in your area is down and we're working on it. It could be several hours. And I'm like, ha ha ha, you know, everything's working. So anyway, that's why I built mine and I'm very glad that I did. Whether or not this makes sense for you is something you're gonna have to dive into the numbers to determine yourself. Now, if you're still here, you must like this kind of content, so I'm gonna link right here, this video, the 2-year reflection looking back since we cut the cord and went off grid.